Hello. Today we'll be reading some Harry Potter fan fiction provided to us by and is an up and coming writer in the Harry Potter fan fiction scene. And for tonight's reading, she has given us a lovely little piece of literature called Vante, Amora. Vante Amora. Chapter 1. Cursed. Severus Snape saw it coming. That was the worst part. When he'd happened upon the three boys scuffling in the third-floor corridor, he'd known there'd be trouble. Walker and Kreck had their wands out already, both boys quick and eager to curse each other, as any he'd met. He saw it even before it happened, the uneven floor, the large ornate mirror on the wall behind them. "Just you try it, Kreck," Walker was close to shouting. "Keep pushing and I will, I swear to God." "You don't have the nerve." Severus stepped in just as the two louds shouted at once. His voice was harsh and impatient. "All right, that's enough." "Vante Amora!" 10 years ago, even half that, there wouldn't have been a chance for the curse to even graze him. Now, though, his body was older, more tired, his reactions slower, and not nearly as keen as they had once been. Almost in slow motion, he saw the shocking pink light of the spell explode from Kreck's wand, his aim affected as his back foot slipped on the wonky stone paving, watching it bounce from the polished glass of the large mirror and fly, straight as an arrow, into his shoulder. Severus blinked twice at the slight burning pain of the curse, then narrowed his eyes and glared at the three Ravenclaws before him, feeling his brow furrowing into deep ridges. 3 pairs of wide, horrified eyes stared back at him, the color draining from each of the boys' faces. There wasn't even a need for words. He could tell they understood the absolute gravitas of the situation they had suddenly found themselves in. "Whose bright idea was it," he muttered with cutting coldness, "to try casting that curse on fellow pupils?" Kreck and Walker's eyes both drifted to their third counterpart, a bookish boy called Bronowski, whose face was quickly changing from ashen white to crimson. I, Bronowski stuttered. Snape's eyebrows quirked higher. "Yes?" I found the curse 2 days ago in the general section of the library. I showed it to Kreck and Walker, but we've not cast it. The boy swallowed. "Before now," he finished, on a whisper. "None of you are to cast the spell again, nor even breathe of its existence to any of your classmates. Is that quite understood?" The 3 boys quickly nodded in silent, shameful agreement. 30 points from Ravenclaw," Snape muttered. "But if I should find that any of you have discussed this incident with anyone, you can expect 3 months of detention each." With a quick, impatient gesture, he sent them away. Alone now in the dark corridor, Severus took several deep, fortifying breaths, trying to prevent the nervous shake that was threatening to take over his body. He concentrated on the lingering, burning feeling of the curse on his shoulder, holding still as he tried to detect any notion of it working through his veins. But other than the lingering burn, he felt nothing. Kreck probably couldn't cast such a potent curse properly, he pondered. Maybe he wouldn't suffer any of the effects. He continued, optimistically. And if there were any, he'd probably be able to shake them off in a few days. Feeling weary and tired suddenly, he quickly finished his rounds and retired to his rooms. The first day wasn't that bad. He barely thought about the incident as he prepared for the day of teaching ahead. There was probably a twinge of something as he took his shower, but then that happened often, and he was still feeling a little lethargic and didn't indulge in it. The morning was busy and passed quickly. By lunchtime, he was starting to feel cautiously but genuinely optimistic. He hadn't read about the curse in many a year, but the common, often repeated rumors would lead anyone to believe that the victim would become raving mad within a few days, and he hardly felt he was on the way to losing any of his rigid composure. As the evening drew to a close, however, Severus began to feel a twinge of doubt, along with many other, more primal, whispering urges. As the evening drew to a close, however, Severus began to feel a twinge. Oh, I just read that. He couldn't deny the slowly growing ache of desire that slipped down his spine like a warm finger. He found it difficult to keep track of his thoughts while he worked. Ideas and theories interrupted with alarming regularity by fleeting but hot, brief, sensually erotic thoughts. In the back of his mind, panic began to build, but he rationalized it was hardly surprising that he was feeling horny, seeing as he'd spent most of the day worrying about erections. As he lay in bed, the erotic thoughts became more clamoring, occurring frequently, and when they did linger on him, indulging in the warming hum of the sweet, sinful images, he was hard now, his used and calloused body finally responding to the singular course his mind was taking, thanks to the curse. He slipped his hand down and languished in the feel of 3 firm strokes, but he hesitated then, his mind alert again to the well-told rumors. It's the worst thing to do. It makes it unbearable. It won't help, only hinder. He withdrew his hand again, though the effects were hardly the physical torture that he had momentarily feared when the spell was first cast. There could be little doubt that the curse was having an effect on him. He would research it properly the next day. He still felt utterly drained, weary in his aging bones, clinging onto the sudden wave of tiredness. He tried to sleep. The second day was not one he'd wish to repeat. Though he'd managed to sleep soundly enough through the night, he awoke with a raging hard-on, which was impossible to ignore. His iron willpower was sorely tempted as he considered giving in to the nagging feeling, but he couldn't shake the lingering thought that it might be a bad mistake. He resisted for the time being. He took a frigidly cold shower, which mercifully had a dampening effect. During his morning lessons, however, he was waspish and inattentive. He stumbled with some of his instructions and let too much disruptive behavior occur during his lack of vigilance. His second lesson of the day was supposed to be a brewing session to test the 4th year Hufflepuff's grip on a simple plant growth enhancer, but he felt the class would be genuinely dangerous if he let it commence while he was so mentally distracted. He improvised the best he could and had them practice the preparation of ingredients without actually brewing them. It meant wasting supplies, but the potential danger was averted. He spent the lesson sat at his desk, scowling, battling hard to ignore the tugging feeling of sexual desire that lingered down inside him. His afternoon sessions were freeze, thankfully, and he wasted no time in making his way to the curse section of the staff library. Flicking to the index at the backmost of the volumes, he laid aside any that had a listing for Vante, Amora, a small pile growing on the table behind him. Folding himself into one of the hard wooden chairs, he pulled the books towards him and started reading through the indexed passages. The serious nature of the curse must not be overlooked. Indeed, a cavalier approach to the casting of Vante Amora has been the downfall of many an otherwise well-respected wizard or witch driven to madness, and a shocking disregard for their own morality by the incessant, inescapable demands of this dangerous spell. Rather than diminishing the effects, increase unbearably over time. Cannot stress enough the need for the cursed to resist the overwhelming urge to pleasure oneself for relief. For the release is but fleeting, and the perverse effects Despite numerous efforts to find a reliable counter-curse for Vante Amora, the only effective method of bringing complete, lasting relief remains the prolonged and effective ministrations of a willing woman, neither forced nor paid. Giving a muttered curse, Severus pushed away from the table and sprang to his feet in a quick but sharp stab of panic. He gathered the books together and stuffed them onto the shelf haphazardly, not bothering to return them to their proper order. His head felt dizzy and strangely heavy as he struggled to regain his unsteady balance and composure. Back in his private rooms, he took another shower, although he barely lasted a minute before he once again had to turn the water to a freezing temperature in an attempt to cool his growing physical desires. Unlike his morning's efforts, the icy streams had no effect on his burning skin or throbbing erection. As his hand drifted down his body once again, he quickly left the cubicle before giving in to temptation. Wrapping himself in his long blue dressing gown, he returned to the living room and poured himself a large whiskey. He downed the drink in one, wincing slightly as the burning liquid ran down into his gut, and promptly poured himself another healthy measure. Sitting in his chair by the large fireplace, he swirled the amber liquid in the crystal-cut tumbler, gazing into the warm depths of his mind, as his mind clashed with warring thoughts and images, all centered round his very real and very difficult predicament. His searching had failed to find a single mention of any sort of counter-curse. He realized with a start that he needed help, and that this was not a curse he would be able to battle by himself. Vivid, erotic, sexually explicit thoughts seeped into his mind like sap in a tree, weaving through and sticking to his every thought, making it impossible to concentrate. A willing woman, neither forced nor paid. The passages he had read in the cramped staff library seemed to echo constantly round his head, vying for attention with busty brunettes who moaned in pleasure, the feel of a hand running up the inside of a smooth, feminine leg. What the hell was he supposed to do? All his life, he had never had a woman willingly give herself to him. The first, he shook his head savagely, to rid himself of the memory of bright green eyes, of flowing red hair, the conjured mental image of heated unions that never took place. The first hadn't cared a damn. He downed the remainder of his drink and stood to pour more, bringing the bottle back with him to his fireside seat. And anything else had been impersonal and paid for. Brief encounters with women of many ages and types, all varied and individual, and tied together by the same fact that they were as utterly detached from it all as he was. He downed another, poured another. There was, of course, a very obvious place he could go to report the incident and gain some sort of treatment, but he was definitely going to avoid exploring that avenue for as long as possible. Talking to Minerva would be similarly awkward, the very personal nature of the thing making him feel a disconcertingly uncharacteristic amount of embarrassment. At least it was Thursday. He'd make it through the next day's teaching and then seek help in Hogsmeade or further afield. Perhaps the local healer would have some suggestions. With any luck, he could return to teaching the following Monday and no one would be the wiser. Alcohol fizzled his blood as he felt his eyelids drooping. The weariness was still there, deep down, his body drained from being constantly tensed in barely reined sexual frustration. Getting into bed, he hoped sleep would come quickly, but in vain. Each time he closed his eyes, his mind was suddenly filled with lewd, brazen thoughts, explicit images, scenarios that descended into depths so depraved they took his breath away. Finally, he drifted into a broken and fitful sleep. Chapter 2. Resigned. The third day was hell on earth. Desperately needing sleep, Severus had instead suffered a night of disgusting and maddening dreams, a parade of nightmarish encounters where beautiful, young, attractive women submitted to his every whim in breathy, ecstasy-filled delight. Waking to find himself in a messy, empty bed, he was overcome with a desperate animal need unlike any he had ever felt before. By God, he wanted a woman. He needed a woman, needed to feel the contrast of soft, warm flesh against the hard, scarred planes of his body. He needed a knowing mouth and the satisfying sensation of a hand gripping his hair, a hot and sweating siren shuddering beneath him, his rock-hard resistance cracking. He stripped off with a spell and gave in to the crippling desire that invaded his every thought. As he wrapped his fingers around his hard and aching cock, his heart hammered in his chest, relief mixed with burning pleasure that rang through his body and made his eyes roll back in his head. Fuck, it felt good. So fucking good. Any of his mind's erotic images would have done. In reality, they all jumbled together in the intense few seconds it took him to climax. Rolling his hips, he let out a strangled groan, spurting thick ropes of hot semen across his chest and stomach. Severus couldn't even be bothered to perform a quick tergio, heaving deep breaths as a soothing calm settled over him, a relaxed lethargy awash with relief. The difference was outstanding and immediate. Feeling like his old, admittedly frigid self, he longed for an extra hour of satisfied sleep. At least he'd be able to focus on his lessons today without any unwelcome distractions. As his 7th year Newt class settled down to their brewing, Severus sat behind his desk and pondered, not for the first time, the difference between his own experience and that described in the passages he had read. Almost all of them had specifically and urgently advised against self-gratification, but he found it had worked a treat. He'd almost made it through the entire day and hadn't even felt a twinge of the curse. Perhaps he'd been right about Kreck's curse, casting being less potent than average. Standing up, he moved around the dungeon, assessing the students as they worked. No, don't spoon it. Kara Sneck, the head girl star of Ravenclaw, was belittling Peter Bonham, her Hufflepuff brewing partner. Look, if you'd have read the instructions, you'd know. It says right here, don't spoon, siphon. You need to suck it up with this. I've got something you can suck, Peter murmured as he took her offered bamboo straw, and Severus saw the tips of Kara's ears turn pink. In that moment, it all came back, everything, tenfold. Grunts, groans, panting, cunts, cocks, and hands and mouths, as many downright dirty things as he could imagine bursting through his mind and body. Like a kick to the gut, Severus doubled over, groaning as he hastily clutched at the edge of the nearest workbench, sending a stool clattering as he did so. Sir, he could hardly hear over the blood rushing through his head. Blinking, trying to focus, he turned to the Hufflepuff girl whose desk he was leaning heavily against. Are you all right, sir? His gaze dropped to her mouth as she spoke, and as her lips formed the words, he imagined her looking up like this, but on her knees. Her pink tongue... No! He swiped his arm sideways, angrily, trying to expel the horrifically inappropriate, absolutely unwanted thought. Class dismissed! Although many eager students hastened to make their exit, one or two lingered while they assessed him with worried glances. And that damn Hufflepuff Marsh, was speaking again. Sir, I really think... Calling on every ounce of his deep reserves of self-control, Severus forced himself to stand up straight, extremely grateful for the way his robes covered his currently raging erection. Your concern is admirable, Miss March, he interrupted, his eyes narrowing, but not needed. This class is dismissed. Don't make me say it again. There was a scrambling flurry as the remaining pupils fled his classroom, but he hardly noticed. Staggering to his desk, he fell to his knees as he caught the near edge with his hands, slumping his arms against the smooth, cool surface. It did little to help. Panting, needy moans echoed in his ears, twisted at his heart, his blood thudding painfully in his rock-hard cock. Flashes of hot, dirty sex ran constantly across his tightly closed eyes, desperate, undeniable, another after another after another, without reprieve descending into the most dangerous and sickening aspects of his past. Indeed, his head, with no way to block them out, the moans turned to tortured, blood-curdling screams. Healer Hermione Granger rubbed at her right temple with her bent finger. She had one hell of a headache coming on. I understand that this is somewhat embarrassing for you, but if you don't listen right now, you could end up with a major infection, so pay attention. She handed the crimson-faced boy a small tin tub. Rub the salve on and around the affected area, she told him, only hesitating slightly. Take the numbing graft once every 2 hours or so until it's no longer uncomfortable. This time, she handed him a big bottle of sky blue potion. And thirdly, if you insist on trying out for the Quidditch team, learn how to properly dismount a crashing broom to avoid this sort of thing in the future. Standing briskly, she walked over to the door and held it open, her signal more than clear. The boy slouched out with a murmured thanks, walking tenderly, his face still flushed with embarrassment. Once he'd gone, she gently closed the door behind him and leant against it, tilting her head back as she sighed. Her headache had felt like a knife to the brain the minute she had woken, and only gotten worse from there. 2 miscast spells, a love potion victim, and a broken wrist, and one rather graphic broom accident later, and the knife felt as though it had been upgraded to a sledgehammer. She rubbed her temples with her index finger and middle finger, making that 2 sledgehammers. Never mind, she consoled herself. The day was finally over, the school week with it, and she had an unopened bottle of red wine waiting for her in her rooms. Pushing away the door, she moved to clear her desk for the evening. 3 knocks rang out. Hermione felt she might weep, but of course she didn't. Resigned, she turned back to the door and opened it, instantly remembering that no matter how bad a particular day was going, it could always get worse. "Professor Snape," she murmured, inclining her head just a touch. "To what do I owe this particular pleasure?" Her tone conveyed how it was anything but. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for tea," he replied. She felt an eyebrow raise in surprise. "Really?" His scowl was dark as thunder. "No, Granger, why the hell do you think I'm here? I'm in need of magical attention." Hermione set her teeth on edge, desperately trying not to roll her eyes as she opened the door wider. "Then you'd better come inside." Chapter 3. Examined. Oh, that's already open. Severus could feel the sweat trickling down his back as he entered the infirmary, angry at himself for not being able to control the situation, even angrier that he'd let the curse progress so far as to prevent him from visiting the healer in Hogsmeade. This was the route he'd least wanted to take. Primly dressed in her knee-length white uniform robes, he noticed the frazzled way curls were widely escaping her long braid, and the dark circles around her eyes. There wasn't even a glimmer of bedside manner about her as she gestured for him to sit. Since she'd joined the Hogwarts staff 2 years ago, he'd had as little interaction with her as possible. Her Gryffindor enthusiasm and insufferable know-it-all attitude had gotten right up his nose, as effectively as it had the first time around. If anything, it was even more abhorrent now she was a grown adult, and maintaining the distant relationship of begrudging acquaintances had been no hardship. But even as he sat in the cold, clinical room, dark images clamored and clawed in his mind, desperately vying for his attention. Things were very bad, and the irritating witch in front of him represented his only available course of action. So she rested her clasped hands on the desk in front of her as she spoke. "What sort of magical attention was it that you were after?" Her tone was sharp and short, and coupled with her rather ragged appearance, it looked like Healer Granger had already had a bad day. Despite everything, he felt a modicum of pleasure at the knowledge he'd be making it worse. "I happened across an impromptu duel while making my rounds, and ended up at the sharp end of a rather unfortunate curse." The way her right eyebrow twitched higher made him want to smash something. And the curse was? He almost smirked. Vante, Amora. Both her eyebrows shot up then, but other than that, her face remained perfectly placid. He felt another small twinge of amusement as they assessed each other across neatly stacked notebooks and piles of files. Like many a time before, he was about to severely test her capabilities. Now then, Granger, he thought, what are you going to make of this challenge? With a dissatisfying mix of begrudging respect and mild disappointment, he watched as she remained the resolute professional, squaring her shoulders as she quickly made notes. Was it a direct hit? No, it deflected by a mirror. She didn't look up from her scribbling quill as she asked her questions. Where were you hit? The shoulder. She glanced up for a second. On the site of an old wound? No, he shook his head. The other shoulder. More notes. And how long ago did it happen? About 3 days. She stared at him then, slightly open-mouthed, eyes wide. 3 days, she repeated with just enough emphasis on the second word to still sound utterly professional. And you didn't think to report it before now? There didn't seem to be a need. But now things have changed? Severus hesitated, having got to the part that was going to be the hardest, especially for someone as intensely private as he was. But he did appreciate Healer Granger's professionalism, and had always accepted her ability. And he remembered there was no other choice. At first, it was nothing that I felt I couldn't control. The curse was surprisingly mild to begin with. When needed, any errant thoughts could easily be curtailed with a sparing dose of personal occlumency. He steepled his fingers together at the tips, looking down at them as he spoke, and now it seemed he was the one who would rather avoid eye contact. As these days have passed, however, it has become harder and harder to maintain a grip on my thoughts, and even my actions. Towards myself only, I should clarify. I had thought to see out my teaching week, and then seek magical attention in Hogsmeade. But that has become impossible. How so? To say I lack concentration would be an understatement, he replied. Over the days, the feeling has amplified until I now find myself completely distracted, almost deranged. He felt the itching trickles of sweat forming at his temples, across his frowning forehead. Even sitting here talking to you is taking more effort than anything I have done in the past 10 years. He started visibly shaking. Every minute, every moment, my mind is crowded, full of the most obscene, explicit thoughts I ever had. My entire body is on edge. Strained, taut, enough that I may snap at any moment. Being anywhere in public would no doubt be a regrettable decision. He risked a glance at her, hoping she hadn't noticed the blush he felt spreading over his cheeks. But she looked at him levelly, calm, and collected, with a hint of concern. On top of that, I'm completely exhausted. I can barely sleep, as it's even worse in the quiet of the night. And even if I do sleep, I become trapped in tiring, endlessly draining dreams. I may seem mostly unaffected, but inside I know I'm close to the edge. This should have been so much more embarrassing, but instead he found that the burden seemed a little lighter, having been shared. And there was only the tiniest, merest hint of a pause. Self-pleasured in the last 3 days? Strike what he'd thought before. Discussing masturbation with a former pupil was one of the most embarrassing things he had ever done in his life. I held off initially, as I was aware of the supposed effect on this curse's potency. However, this morning I found the temptation too great. He pretended to have a complete fascination with the grain of wood of her desk. So after you were tempted, she half mumbled, what happened? I lay in bed, completely covered in cum. The thought was there, the words so very close to the tip of his tongue, but he resisted. There was noticeable immediate relief, which lasted for a considerable section of the day. I did think that maybe the student's cursing ability
meant that my own self-satisfaction may have been enough to counter it.
That wasn't the case?
No, it all came back full force, even stronger than before, although I wouldn't have thought that possible previously. It's a raw physical need, and I can barely contain it.
His hands gripped painfully at the arms of his chair, while inside, sick, licentious imaginings turned his stomach and tasted metallic in his mouth. He cautioned another glance at Granger, who was mercifully writing frantic notes. He had the sudden knowledge that, had she happened to look up at him, he would have dragged her across the desk and taken her for himself. Shaken by the sudden, vividly clear, absolutely disturbing realization, he forced himself to keep talking, to do anything to distract himself. The final straw occurred during my last lesson. The reaction I had was intense, physical, and painful. I also found myself thinking about a student in an utterly inappropriate manner, and I realized I needed to seek immediate professional help. Finally, he thought, he heard her mutter, under her breath as she wrote more notes. Can you please confirm your sexuality? She looked up at him. I'm sorry to ask for protected information of a colleague, but it's necessary for accurate treatment. Of course, he murmured, avoiding eye contact with her at all costs. I'm heterosexual. She finished writing her notes. All right, she said, standing swiftly and moving around the desk towards him. I'm going to need you to remove your trousers. Panic and confusion hit him hard in a double measure. Surely she wasn't about to treat him herself. Even before the thought was fully formed in his mind, his mind rushed ahead, jumping to her legs wrapped around him as he fucked her hard on the desk, curls tumbling over his hands as he dug his fingers into her hair. Imagine him filling her arrogant mouth with his hard cock and hot semen. You can't, he wheezed. He was holding out a hand with his palm towards her, pushing her away with the force of desperation alone. I will not allow your Gryffindor pig-headedness to catapult us into a situation that makes a professional relationship impossible, nor am I interested in partaking in your sexual martyrdom, Granger. He watched as the crinkle of confusion on her face melted away, leaving a faint hint of pink on her cheeks, but transforming into a cold, cutting, and loathing glare. When she spoke, her voice could have frozen the lake. I assure you, she hissed, ice cutting into his skin, dampening the curse and igniting his shame. Should the curse necessitate actual sexual interaction as treatment, a more suitable candidate could be arranged, by which I mean almost anything else. Those last few words stabbed like icicles. However, magical sexual enhancement can be physically dangerous, particularly in males. Sustained flow of the blood to the genital area, especially over the course of days, could lead to permanent damage. So unless you actually want your dick to drop off, Professor, I'd be grateful if you'd remove your trousers and underwear and lie down on the examination table. Truly chastised, Severus hardly hesitated, doing just as she'd asked, as she tergioed her hands and donned a thin rubber glove. She noticed his interest and explained. I find them superior to any barrier spell I've tried, she said as she snapped on the second glove. Some Muggle solutions are better. He was amused by that, and perhaps that had been her intention, as he suddenly felt relaxed enough for this examination to happen without his actually literally dying of humiliation. He watched her as she stepped closer, her warm amber eyes roaming down his body, focusing on his aching erection. His breathing became rough. His heartbeat kicked up a notch as he noticed her eyes widening ever so slightly. Is there usually an engorgement effect due to Vante Amora? She asked him outright. No, he didn't smirk, but God, it was hard not to. Not that I've noticed. I see, she said coolly, and damn it, he did smirk then. Thankfully, she didn't appear to notice as she bent over and examined him at different angles, inspecting him for whatever it was she was hoping to find, or not find, in this case. Almost in slow motion, her gloved hands reached out towards him. He had a firm hold of her wrist within a split second.
If you move even a quarter of an inch closer, he warned, his voice low, you and I are going to become acquainted in a decidedly more intimate manner, and in a way that you've already implied would not be favorable.
Point taken, she murmured. She maturely stepped away from the table and pulled the gloves off again. He hastily stood and rearranged his clothing while her back was intentionally turned. I can't see any adverse effects to the genital area as yet, so I think we still have time to find a solution before the curse causes any long-term damage. She washed her hands in the large Belfast sink, even though she hadn't actually touched him. And there was something familiar about the unconsciously dismissive gesture that cut Severus somehow, more than anything else that had transpired. For now, I suggest we give you a break for a while with a heavy dose of sedatives and some magically induced sleep. They sat in the chairs again, the desk solidly between them. You've taken some heavy physical strain over the past few days, she continued, and it's not uncommon for curses to completely break the sleeping cycle. Not only would it allow you some time to rest and recuperate, it will allow me to undertake my own research in the healing field, see if we can find some sort of lasting remedy. Besides, if the course of your treatment does require a more physical solution, you will need some energy. He felt them again, the orgy of erotic ideas cavorting in the depths of his mind, fighting to come to the fore at her implication. It was getting harder to ignore them. They clung to his thoughts like slime. But he was bone tired. He nodded in agreement to her suggestion. Professor Snape, there is another question I need to ask. He pulled on the last of his reserves, fighting back the temptations, and looked at Granger, understanding from her tone that it was important. The fact of the matter is, in your particular case, as a female healer, I do have the ability to physically counteract the curse to some degree in the direst of circumstances. Dire indeed, from the unconscious pull of disgust at her mouth. Unsavory as the idea was, his body ached, clamored at the notion, begged for it, right here, right now. The decision is, of course, up to you, she continued. I can promise you my utmost discretion and professionality, and I don't foresee it being a requirement, but I obviously would not want to provide any sort of physical treatment without your consent. The lecherous thoughts inside him howled, baying for her touch, but he was suddenly so very tired, weary to the bones, that he mercifully found that even conscious thought was becoming a struggle. Trying to focus on the healer, he nodded his acquiescence. You have it, my consent. Whatever is needed, I trust your judgment. Thank you, Professor, she murmured. I appreciate that. She briskly ushered him into a small side room, explaining that placing him in the separate quarantine bay would protect his privacy, should she be required to treat any pupils over the coming days. The thought served as a reminder to him, as she carefully cast varying measures of different numbing draughts into a single flask. Despite his extreme tiredness, he couldn't help but notice her skilled competency as she dispensed the potions. He cleared his throat. Granger, he began, then hesitated, cursing himself as a coward. She was a colleague, an experienced professional, a fellow veteran, and now, seemingly, his personal ally for the duration of his treatment. He granted due respect to others far less deserving. Hermione, he began, I would be very grateful if you could keep the more personal aspects of my current predicament confidential. She handed him the flask and watched carefully as he drank it down in one go. Of course, she assured him, as she took the empty flask from him. My healer's pledge alone ensures that anything that transpires between us is in the strictest of confidence. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get Minerva to understand that, but I will, somehow. The effects of the physically and mentally numbing potions were immediate and strong. Her words became slowed, echoey in his ears. Let's get you to bed. He moved towards the clean, white, oh-so-deliciously tempting bed, as though he was floating underwater, items of clothing being swept off and away as if by the currents, slipping between the crisp sheets. He felt such an intense feeling of relief and utter mindlessness that he felt as though he might cry. Completely, involuntarily, he heard a strangled sob rise from his throat as he closed his eyes. "It's okay, Severus." Her voice washed over him, lulling him into oblivion. "It's going to be all right, I promise." And in the very last moments, before he sank completely into the deep, vast blackness of unconsciousness, his mind teased him with the very cruelest and most tormenting of temptations. He imagined her quick, warm kiss on his lips. Chapter 4. Challenged. Hermione had barely collapsed into the cushioned chair in her office before casting the Accio spell. As the bottle of wine accompanying glass flew into the door to her chambers, she clasped to them as if they were a lifeline. Popping the cork with a charm, she poured several glugs of the ruby liquid into the large bowl of the wine glass, hesitated but a moment, and added a couple more glugs for good measure. Gulping down several swallows, she felt the familiar welcoming warmth spread through her veins, and she actually felt relaxed for the first time in about 15 hours. With a snort of unamused laughter, she shook her head in disbelief. What a fucking day! Not for the first time, she'd felt the nagging doubts and insistent feeling that she was wasting away her talents and in a place that had once been so dear to her. Her mind drifted back to the moment Minerva had made her proposal, so casually, sat back in one of the deep armchairs of Hermione's snug little living room. The thought of returning to Hogwarts after so many years had been so tempting, a fresh start, but with old roots, and a chance to get away from St. Mungo's, and the pressure, and the long hours, and the loneliness. God, the loneliness. She'd almost gotten to the bottom of her glass already. She realized in surprise. Reaching forward, she poured herself a little top-up and decided to take it slower. That, at least, had been different at Hogwarts. The days of uninspired meals for one, of endless games of solitaire, and tedious, lonely evenings were long gone. She always ate her meals with her colleagues, had built up strong friendships with people she had revered since her childhood, and knew that any number of her friends here would happily spend a companionable evening discussing new research literature or school gossip. It came at a price, though. Professionally, she was completely stunted. It wasn't like she hadn't been warned. Minerva had made it clear that a fully qualified healer was not at all required in the position, and that she wouldn't be challenged by any magical complaints she would tend to. And boy, she had been right. From scuffs, from fights and falls, to administered counterspells and curses, nothing that the unruly students presented to her had given her anything like a mental challenge. Of course, it hadn't always been that way. She thought, as she often did, of Poppy Pomfrey, whose retirement to enjoy sun-soaked days in a cottage by the sea had created a vacancy that Hermione had stepped into. Poppy had been a woman who excelled in most dreadful circumstances, wading through and pushing back the tides of the Battle of Hogwarts, seemingly armed with only meta-witch training, her wealth of experience, and a will of determined steel. Although Hermione would never wish to return to such dark days, she had sometimes wondered what her job would be like if she had to. Or if Dumbledore was still headmaster instead of Minerva, she thought wryly. Sighing, she took another sip of her wine, mulling over the sharp, rich taste in her mouth. A phrase her mother had been keen on using came to mind. Be careful what you wish for. She'd wanted more, wanted something to happen. She wanted a challenge, and damned if she hadn't got one. Swiveling her chair round, she looked out the tall, narrow, internal windows of her office into the dimly lit quarantine bay beyond. He was still lying on his back, with his arms above the sheets at his sides, exactly as she had left him. His dark hair spilled across the pillow, and from here she could see the slight graying of hair on his temple facing her, and the strong profile of his nose. Large, yes, but straight and distinguished, and not what she would call hooked, really. She'd definitely seen worse. She sat in the silence of her office, in the dim glow of the candles, sipping gently on her wine and watching him. The dose of sedative potions she had administered was perhaps slightly overcautious, but his current state of magical unconsciousness was necessary. Other than the gentle rise and fall of his chest, he was motionless. Hermione finished the last few sips in her glass and felt them fizz in her blood. Oh, but this was an ironic turn-up for the books. Finally, she had a case that would test her abilities, and it just so happened it would test her mental resolve as well. Neither of them had tried to conceal the utter indifference that underpinned their working and social relationships. Almost the moment she returned to school, she'd been reminded of his snobbish superiority, his wry comments dripping with sarcasm, his patronizing tone doubly insulting now that she was a grown woman. She was well aware that he was a hero, of course. Harry had certainly gone on about that enough. But she reasoned it was quite common to respect heroes and dislike them at the same time. Trailing her fingertip gently round the crystal rim of the empty glass, she considered pouring herself another. It was tempting, though she had better wait until she was back in her rooms at least. With a sigh, she opened a drawer and pulled out a request slip for the St. Mungo's library. She filled it out quickly, the questions familiar despite the lengthy time it had been since she had last requested a research book. She gave a brief outline of the curse she was treating, as well as the name and cataloging codes. With a tap of her wand, the slip disappeared in a flash of blue light. After one more long, assessing look at her sleeping charge, she set the alert charms that would warn her if he moved or awoke in the night. Picking up her glass bottle, she opened the heavy door to her chambers. It really wasn't a flattering picture of herself, she had to admit. Standing awkwardly, a little sideways on, she looked frumpy and plain, and held a pose without moving as if it were a muggle's shot. The woman beside her, however, looked professionally groomed as ever. Blonde, sleek hair and red lipstick on a winning smile were a stark contrast to the white healer's robes. Hermione had always found a wealth of things to admire about Euphemia Sobel, and her style was not the least of them. No matter how early the shift or how many overtime hours had passed, her mentor had always seemed perfect, inside and out. As she looked at her late teacher and friend, her mind drifted back once again to that memory that had been popping up since the professor had knocked on the infirmary door. Do you find something amusing with the word erection, Miss Granger? Pinned by the older woman's blue stare, gazing steadily over the rims of her thin-framed glasses, and being painfully virginal to boot, Hermione had seriously considered biting her own hand to keep from giggling. No, Healer Sobel, she had managed to gasp out. Good, because the next case isn't quite so amusing. Walking down the white, echoing corridor of the ward, Healer Sobel approached the next door and pulled down the metal viewing hatch. The poor wizard inside was a sorry sight. She still remembered the sound of Euphemia's voice as she stared through the hatch at a shell of a man scrunched up on his side in a huddle on the floor. This poor patient was too far gone when they found him. I'm afraid there is absolutely no chance of recovery at this point. Hermione swallowed, remembering how laughter had turned to bile in her throat. Vante, Amora, and spells of its ilk are sometimes most dangerous you are likely to face. Sex and sexuality. They are as biological as they are emotional, with the strength to take over our bodies and our minds. Don't underestimate it. Take it seriously. And Hermione had never giggled at the word erection or anything at all related to it ever again. Sighing as she carefully placed the picture back in its precise home on her mantelpiece, remembering the wine, still enticingly open, she hung on a brief moment of tempted indecision. There was a case to research, however, and a patient to heal. Recorking the bottle on another quick charm, she slid it back into the wine rack. Severus felt as though he
was being watched before the Dark Lord even spoke. Severus, the sibilant sound echoing above the shocking, gasping noises in the room. My lord, he stepped forward and bowed. Is there nothing here to tempt your discerning tastes? There was a disorienting spin, something changing. Place? Time? Before it even started, he knew what was coming. The pain was almost unbearable, so encompassing. He felt it course through his whole body. The sharpness of it dulled until it was a screaming ache in every muscle. He didn't know whose hand it was, other than the fact that it wasn't his. But the relief he felt was instant, undeniable. Despite himself, despite the cheers and the catcalls and the bellowing crowd around him, he lost control and sunk back into a dark oblivion. Waking, confused, Hermione registered the alert charms sounding. Dressing hastily with a spell, she tied her hair back into a messy bun and hurried into her office. She could see him through the narrow windows, writhing on the bed, twisting the covers, and the pillow beneath him drenched in sweat. Hurrying to his bedside, she pulled back the sheets, disentangling them from his tensed, shaking limbs. Despite freeing him, he still struggled and writhed, his eyes tightly closed, taking a deep breath, and they tried to steady her own rapid pulse. The potion she'd given him was managing to keep him unconscious, just about, but he was still suffering. She did a quick mental calculation, but it was no good. She couldn't dose him again for another 5 hours at least. Euphremia's voice rang in her head, as clear as it had earlier. Physical treatment, without consent, can mean the difference between life and death. She'd been shocked, almost incensed at the sight of her mentor leaning over to kiss the patient on the lips that first time. The vivid mark of red lipstick on the suddenly motionless wizard's lips had looked like a painful wound. As always, the healer had been right. When the thought had come to her earlier, she had barely given herself time to consider it. Quickly and efficiently, she dispensed the kiss and watched, satisfied, as the patient relaxed back into complete unconsciousness, just as the other patient had done on that ward visit years ago. The thought was no more appealing than the first time around, and she steeled herself once again to kiss her former professor. Hovering close, closing her eyes at the last moment, she pressed her lips against his. This time, she noticed the warmth, the contrast of soft lips and rough stubble, and the rush of air against her face as she gasped. He collapsed back, most of the strain leaving his twisted back and limbs. But in its place came a sudden and violent shaking. Alarmed, Hermione stared down at the professor, reaching out to test the temperature of his slick skin. Assured he didn't have a fever, she concluded the seizure must be due to the physical effects of the curse, though it was slight comfort considering the way his body was rattling the bed frame against the wall. How could the curse have advanced so quickly, so dangerously? She'd been assured that the curse had no visible effects. As she talked to him across her desk, surprising as it had seemed, especially considering the curse had already been 3 days old. The fact that the spell initially had been deflected was a consideration, though, and the fact that a student had cast it. But this was Severus Snape, whose control was of the kind most could only dream about, and who always seemed the master of his own thoughts. She reconsidered her original assessment. Yes, there seemed to be few physical effects, but how much of that was the man not willing to show the level of his distress? She realized the truth with sudden, awful certainty. She underestimated him foolishly. The curse was just as potent as ever. It was just that he'd managed to control himself well above and beyond the ability of the average wizard. Now, there was no denying it. Sweat poured from him as he shuddered violently, his head thrashing from side to side, his teeth gritted, buying herself time while she considered the next steps. She reached out and brushed the hair from his face, and when it seemed to quiet him a little, she got bolder. Dragging her fingertips slowly, she followed the line of his jaw down his neck, across the gnarled snags and bumps of his scars, where his neck met his shoulders. When she reached his bare chest, heaving with the shuddering breaths, she laid her palm flat. She dragged her hand across the soft mat of black hair on his chest, down his ribs, which she could feel so clearly she could nearly count them. He took a long, deep breath, letting it out slowly. More of the shakes seemed to subside, but not altogether. Even his breathing got easier as she could see the severe trembling in his arms and shoulders and neck. Hermione's heartbeat thundered in her chest. She wasn't a stranger to the treatment of this curse, and had heard many a rumor in the corridors of St. Mungo's sexual healing department. There were ways, efficient ways, to aid a patient's comfort, while a more permanent solution was arranged. Whether or not they were actually ethical was another matter. She swallowed against the dryness of her throat. Indecision raged in her. Teetering back and forth, she moved forward, then hesitated, her hand hovering slightly extended towards one of the absolutely least appealing men in her acquaintance. She was starting to seriously doubt her usually sound judgment. The fact she was even considering. Even as she wavered, however, the constant shuddering of his body did not subside. She knew what it could mean, the danger he was in, and he'd given her his consent. She decided to act. Her palm flat again, she reached out, caressing his stomach. His body flinched at the contact, and Hermione felt the surprising definition of his muscles beneath his skin. She dragged her hand lower, one finger tracing along the lines that stretched between his hips at the waistband of his boxer shorts. His well-proportioned appendage was straining against the material, quivering his body as his body trembled. Remembering the sight of him, naked from the waist down, on her examination table, made her swallow unsteadily. She wondered briefly if she should wear gloves, but that seemed maybe a little too clinical. She cast a quick barrier spell on her hand instead. Deciding that she should keep his boxers on to provide at least the illusion of privacy, she slipped her hand beneath the waistband, taking a deep breath, and with one last desperate grasp at some Gryffindor courage, she wrapped her hand around him. Hot and so hard, he felt like steel wrapped in velvet. It had been so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like, holding one in her hand like this. She ran her hand up his length experimentally, and he was really big. He let out an agonized groan, surprising her in the pressing silence of the room. She snapped her head to look up at him in a quick stab of panic, dreading to think how she would explain this if he were to awake. But he was still unconscious, thank the gods, though his head was now tilted back, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. She sped up, stroking the length of him, and in barely a few seconds he came. His head rolled back, dark hair dragging across his pillow, his deep voice groaning low, the sharp line of his jaw, his tight body flexing, aching. Then he collapsed into shuddered, his hips jerking, and she felt his warm semen spill all down the back of her hand, the barrier spell doing nothing. Oh, fuck. This was completely, absolutely, most definitely not ethical. But after his climax, his seizures stopped immediately, and once again he sank into oblivion, his body relaxing into deep unconsciousness. She let out the deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Feeling her face burning, she cast a quick but thorough tergio both on him and her hand. Then she straightened his sheets, tucking him in again, and reset the warning alarms. His legs were shaky as she went back to her own rooms, desperately trying not to think about what had just happened, trying not to remember how manly his groans were, how powerful it felt, making a man orgasm. She slumped into one of her dining tables, leaning her elbows on the table and her head in her hands. She'd have to fucking tell him, god damn it.
Chapter 5. Intrigued. When Severus awoke, he was surprised to find that he felt more relaxed and well rested than he had for weeks, even before the damned curse. Even though he felt the whispers of it still in the depths of his mind, he was easily able to control it with some basic occlumency. And feeling as energized as he did right then, that was no bother. He stretched indulgently, his legs so long his feet pressed against the metal frame of the bed, deliciously relaxed. He had to give Granger her due. She'd acted professionally, and with practiced efficiency, her dosage of sedatives was obviously well judged and effective. The fact that he was awake and moving obviously triggered some sort of alert, as a house elf appeared with a selection of his own clothing and other necessary belongings, and offering tea or coffee. He took the steaming mug of black coffee gratefully, taking a cautious sip, feeling positively human. His hypothesis that the curse was not fully potent seemed all the more accurate now. Kreck's casting skills weren't nearly as good as his eagerness to use them would suggest, and the spell had been deflected by the mirror initially. That may have something to do with it. He got up long enough to clean himself and shave, and to tug on a pair of pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, but he was surprised at how lethargic he still felt. Lazily, he climbed back into bed. As loathed as he was to admit it, he was intrigued by how well Granger had assessed the situation. She'd obviously had a good measure of the curse to treat it so well with numbing drafts alone. He wanted to ask her about it, what further treatments she was considering, but for some reason she seemed to be ignoring him. He saw her occasionally through the tall windows of her office, moving around and pulling books from the rammed shelves behind her. He could have sworn she looked this way once or twice, but each time he caught her eye, she turned her head sharply before he could beckon her over. Amusement stirred in him. Surely she couldn't be feeling shy about all this all of a sudden. She'd been the absolute paragon of resolutely professional healer yesterday. The icy way he stripped for her had him falling over himself to obey. She surely couldn't have lost that confidence overnight. It had been years since he last saw her doubt herself, not since her classroom days. But as her eyes met his for the third time, only to quickly dart back to what was presumably a book on her desk or in her lap, there was no denying it. He felt himself smirking. Who'd have thought that being sexually cursed could have its upsides? Looking around, he found what he was searching for, a round red button. He pressed it, and a red light went on above his head with a low, bonging chime. She looked up again, her eyes narrowed in annoyance. He was pleased to see. Despite that, she stood up immediately, walking the fair distance from her office to stand at the foot of his bed. She crossed her arms, one eyebrow lifting, but was that a hint of a blush on her cheeks? Yes, she asked. Would it be entirely impertinent to request something to eat? Almost anything would do, he said dryly. Of course, there's no problem. The house elf who helps here in the infirmary is called Tammy. She's quite independent, but she'll get you anything you need. Just call for her. With that brisk response, she was already turning on her heel, heading back to her office. He'd waited until she walked all the way back, until she'd almost escaped through the door to her sanctum, when he reached out and pressed the red button again. The chime above rang with a low bing-bong. She was good at turning on her heel. Her eyes were glaring daggers at him as she set her jaw. She still hadn't uncrossed her arms. She walked back to the foot of his bed. Yes, she said, a little through her teeth this time. Actually, I was wondering if you had a moment to chat about my predicament. He stretched out the last word, diverted by the way her warm amber eyes glanced briefly to his hard-on, still tenting the bedsheets. To her credit, however, she squared her shoulders and met his eye again. Yes, I think we should talk, she agreed. Just let me get my notebook. In a moment, she was sat in the chair next to his bed, an alluring pair of dark-framed reading glasses perched on her nose, and he felt the curse clawing up his spine when she looked at him over the top of them. How are you feeling now? She was once again the resolute healer.
Surprisingly well, actually, he admitted, setting into the formality between them again. I must congratulate you on the efficiency of your numbing drafts. I hadn't realized how tired I was.
Well, actually, she started, but he interrupted.
Now, it's not the time to be modest.
He smirked at her and saw the pink blush rising in her cheeks again.
Intriguing.
I feel much more myself
and able to effectively resist the curse again. Getting a decent night's sleep has done the world of good, so thank you.
She nodded awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. She wasn't making notes this time, her eyes still decisively crossed.
I think it must be to do with the curse being less potent than usual, he continued. I wondered if maybe the deflection in the mirror may have decreased the potency. What do you think?
She sighed deeply, taking off her glasses. She looked at him, her eyes guarded, her expression hard to read. He wasn't sure if she pitied him or hated him. Both were disagreeable. Actually, I'm afraid the curse may be further developed than we initially thought, she said, looking back down at her notes again.
Why so? He asked her, surprised.
Though I will admit, you seem to be able to weather this strong curse better than the average wizard. She glanced at him as she hesitated. I think your strong mental abilities are masking the genuine stages of the curse's development and its effect on you. It's undeniable that you are skilled at masking your emotions. She coughed a little, clearing her throat. She took the glass from the neck of the water carafe next to his bed, turned it upright, cast herself some water. She sipped it cautiously, still looking almost anywhere other than directly into his eyes. He waited. There was obviously more she had to say. Last night you had terrible seizures. I was woken by alert alarms and found you thrashing and shaking in your sleep. Night seizures only tend to begin once the curse has already reached the second stage. I'm afraid we may not have as much time to find a suitable treatment as I originally assumed. He leaned back against his pillows, taking in what she had said, but couldn't shake the fact that his own experiences just felt so different. The curse was supposed to grow in potency and should be unbearable now, but it felt less potent than ever. She took another sip of water, and he noticed her hands were shaking ever so slightly. I was worried about your prognosis, frankly, when I realized. Luckily, she took a deep breath and continued, I was able to intervene with some physical treatment. He quirked his eyebrow at her, watching the blush slowly creep up her cheeks again, which seemed to be immediately effective. I believe it's the after effects of that treatment that you're feeling now, rather than the sedatives. I seem to have bought us some extra time. She stopped speaking, but didn't look at him. Diverted, he couldn't help but ask,
What kind of physical treatment? He murmured.
She snuffled the end of her nose with the back of her hand, still not meeting his eyes. Her cheeks seemed to be getting even more pink. He tried not to smirk. I touched you, she mumbled, looking up at the ceiling.
What was that?
I touched you, she muttered again, meeting his gaze, her eyes flashing angrily.
Intriguing. What do you mean, touched, Granger?
He asked her, the temptation to tease just too great. Her cheeks were getting redder by the second. She ground her teeth, keeping quiet.
You're not going to be coy now, are you? He goaded her. Surely I have the right, as the patient, to know what treatments my healer is administering.
He was using his teacher's voice, but goddamn, it was just so easy. Her blush spread over her entire face at this point. She looked so red. She looked as red as a beetroot. To be fair, she hadn't looked away again. But if looks could kill, he'd be a corpse on the bed already. He murmured, his voice low. Yes, all right, I wanked you off in your sleep, okay? She spat out with an exasperated sigh. Severus blinked. If he hadn't happened to be in bed already, he'd have fallen clean over. He didn't know what he expected her to say, but it definitely hadn't been that.
His head fell back against the headboard in surprise. He chuckled, his amusement immense. Any embarrassment he might have felt was overridden by his shock. The heated images in his mind, imagining what her hand had felt like, even as his body clamored and the curse screamed at him, shouting together in unison. Yes, fuck yes, that's a fucking fantastic idea. Get her to do it again, only this time, make sure she lets us watch. Fucking hell, Granger, he chuckled again, shaking his head in disbelief. Her cheeks were still a rather unflattering shade of deep red, but she had the wickedest of sly smiles on her face as she looked at him, and she chuckled a little too. I'll admit it wasn't exactly ethical, she said, but it was obviously effective. His heart thudded, his pulse throbbing. I agree, he told her, being purposely vague as to which. She fidgeted and took another sip of water. She glanced at him over the rim of her glass, large amber eyes laughing at him. He felt something catch in his chest. I've been reading up on a possible treatment route to explore, she continued, instantly back to her professional self. As I'm sure you'd already confirmed, there isn't an effective counter-curse. But I've had some old colleagues in sexual healing at St. Mungo's, so I've already written to them to see if there's any trial treatments, a new research we might try exploring. They should get back to me any time now. He nodded, grateful for her efficiency, her connections. He was still feeling off balance, though. He wondered if his cheeks might be a little red, too. Professor, she leant a bit nearer to him. I'm sorry, but I have to ask, is there someone we could contact for you? He frowned in confusion. He could think of literally nothing he'd like less than have her contact anyone he'd ever known about any of this. I mean, she swallowed. Any past acquaintances you might have had? Any lady friends? Perhaps an ex-girlfriend? Only we do need to consider finding someone to help you recover. Her words were like ice, sharp ice that cut into him. He felt a churning, bitter sickness swirling in his gut. The amusement he'd felt evaporated away into nothing. When he spoke, his voice was tight, strained, though he hadn't realized it. No. No one, she hesitated, at all. He bowed his head, afraid he might throw up. What a sad, pathetic, lonely old husk of a man she must think of him. And she'd be right. No, he said again, the single word catching in his throat. He kept his head bowed, staring into his lap, at the ridiculous tent of bedsheets that more than demonstrated how very alone he was in the world. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her hand reach out. She patted his bare arm gently, her warm touch, desire tracing across his skin in hot tendrils. I'm sorry, Severus, she murmured. He felt a kick of anger in his gut, resentment. All he'd wanted was a quiet life, to wither and die in his own miserable company, and he couldn't even manage that. Oh, fuck off, Granger, he muttered. She pulled her hand away. He looked up at her, found her expression infuriatingly sympathetic. He felt like shit. You don't have to be all mournful about it, he muttered. I'm hardly the most pitifully lonely person to have ever lived. She gave him a look that seemed to imply she didn't quite believe him, which only pissed him off even more. Seriously, fuck off, he said again, as though if she had left him at that moment, he'd have lost his rag completely. Shame curled inside him, and he felt horribly embarrassed. But it was unfair that she should make him feel so awful about the lack of emotional connections in his life. She glanced up at him, one eyebrow quirked infuriatingly, and he challenged her. What if I were to say to you, okay, Granger, produce someone, right here, right now, who would be willing to fuck you for days for the sake of a fucking curse? Could you do it? She opened her mouth to give him her smug retort, but then stopped, hesitating. He could see the thoughts on her face, clear as day, as she pondered the quandary. obviously thinking of potential candidates, then dismissing each one due to their being attached, potentially unwilling, too complicated. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing again, her mouth closing with a quiet snap. Exactly, he spat bitterly. Her eyes were still narrowed, but her lips twisted in a sly little grin. Someone other than you mean? She retorted, sneering sarcastically. Ah, fuck, he gasped, laughing, conceding. His amusement returned tenfold, his body calling out for her, the curse howling in agreement. His mind was suddenly filled with the possibilities, her and him together for days, curing this curse. The ache of the desire was absolute, intense, his erection throbbing painfully. Even so, he was tickled, loving her brazenness, her directness, that she could still answer every one of his questions. He cupped himself, squeezing, trying, just for a second, of the merest hint of relief, and he was barely able to drag his hand away again. I would do it too, you witch, he murmured, his mouth smirking, his gaze tangled with hers. I know, she said, smiling smugly, all insufferable know-it-all. He chuckled again, beyond amused. But fucking Christ, he was already sliding dangerously and deeply back into the insistent claws of the curse's desire. He could feel the darkness of it, the insidiousness. He closed his eyes, fighting for control. I'm sorry, she said for the third time that morning. I know this isn't good for your curse. He flopped over onto his belly, pressing his face into the pillow, his hips into the mattress. He cursed loudly, the muffled sound, panting, turning into quiet screams in his mind. He'd never needed a wank more in his life. Here, drink this. Her voice was further away, and when he turned his head to look at her, she was once again deftly dispensing a complex mix of potions. She held the flask out to him, and he flipped over onto his back. Again, and he took it from her. And he drank it in one. It's another strong sedative, she explained. It should have a dampening effect on your entire emotional state, including the curse's effects as well. According to the research, it's supposed to be non-drowsy, but you'll probably feel sleepy nonetheless. She was right. It was working. He felt all of his amusement and anxiousness and loneliness leaving him, his persona fading until he felt unreal, like he was stuffed with cotton wool. He nodded, his head woozy, his eyes drowsy. Thank you, Granger, he mumbled. Any time, Professor. Her words echoed. She sounded like she was smiling. All right, that's all we have for tonight from Vante Amora by... that is only a sample of the full story. We may be reading the rest in the future. Who knows? Are there any questions from the audience? Did I have a favorite character? Well, that's got to really be between Hermione and Snape. Say Bing Bong again. I think I'll have to choose Hermione over Snape, though. Okay, well, should I read? The fuck? Oh, fuck! The printer fucked this up. Can I still read this? Nah, like the first letter of every sentence is missing, for fuck's sake. I did print Wasteland, but I mean, I could try. I could try and read Wasteland. It's just a bit fucked. What does this even say? Nah, it's too fucked. I'm sorry. Oh, April is April. Okay, that's not okay. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnbergersee with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar kein Russenstam aus Litauen es Deutsch. And when we were children staying in at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night, and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch, what branches grow, out of this stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you only know a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at the morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. Will show you fear in a handful of dust. Frisch wird der Wind, der Heimat zu, mein irisch kind, wo weilest du? You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back, late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed, and I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold, nonetheless. Is known to be the wisest woman in Europe. With a wicked pack of cards, here, she said, is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look, here is Belladonna, the lady of the rocks, the lady of situations. And here is the one-eyed merchant, and this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. Fear death by water. I see crowds of people walking round the ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. Unreal City. Under the brown fog of winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many. Had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. Flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew, and stopped him, crying, Stetson, you were the one with me in the ships at Millais. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence, that's friend to men. Or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecture, mon semblable, mon frère. 2. A game of chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed like the marble where the glass held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table, as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory-colored glasses, unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered, or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned in the scents and odors stirred by the air that freshened from the window. These ascended, fattening, the prolonged candle flames flung their smoke into the liquora, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge sea wood fed with copper, burned green and orange framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed The Change of Philomel by the Barbarous King. More of this page is like cut off. Okay, whatever. It's too fucked up. I can't read this shit. I have to like every single line. There's like more shit cut off. So, rip. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed erotic Harry Potter fanfiction. Good night.